G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at the race week preview and my final thoughts ahead of the Las Vegas Grand Prix this coming weekend. As always, if you're new around here, you're enjoying the content, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. So I think with this video, it's usually broken up into my chip usage, then the talking points for the weekend, and then review of my team selection dilemmas heading into the Grand Prix. I'm going to do it a little differently this week where we put the talking points at the front of the video. The reason why I think there's a lot of different factors that I want to consider heading into this weekend with the autopilot chip for myself. A number of other people have thought about using that no negative and how these factors can implicate how we use the remaining chips, if any, that we have available to us. So we have never raced at Las Vegas before. The first time we've come to this circuit, street circuit, which are historically more challenging. We find there's at these circuits a higher DNF rate. And when you factor in some weather concerns expected on the Thursday and the Friday, the expectation that the temperature in the night is going to be around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius, around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, how this can implicate the performance of the car, how drivers respond to the evolution of the track, and ultimately what that could mean to drivers, possible DNFs, all that stuff that is ultimately going to affect our fantasy team as well. So I have some reservations that there could be a bit of carnage. The first turn on lap one has been speculated by many as something that we could see much like Brazil recently, where there was just collisions from the outset, ruined a number of people's races. And I'm not pretending I'm an expert on this track, but having done it a number of times on the F123 game, having looked into, I guess, the track characteristics, how sharp some of these turns are, we could see a little bit of chaos in the early stages as drivers come to grips with the track and drivers around them too. So I think for me, that opens the door for the no negative in the autopilot. As I pointed out, I'm going to cover that in a minute. But there are also going to be cars that are going to thrive on this track. Red Bull, Ferrari, Williams, all cars with exceptional straight line speed. It is essentially a rectangular circuit. Some have described it like the Monza of street circuits. So I definitely expect all of these teams are going to perform very well. I have a sneaking suspicion Charles Leclerc might be out for something. He's had a couple of really disappointing weekends lately, so I have high hopes for him. And I've got at the bottom here, there's been for the last couple of races speculation that a Ferrari might make Leclerc take a grid penalty. There, at the time of recording, has been no news on that, and whether that actually comes to fruition is something different altogether. But after what we saw in Brazil with that engine failure on the formation lap, those hydraulic problems he was encountering, it would be interesting to see Ferrari move ahead with something like that at a circuit that many are expecting them to do well at. That just makes absolutely no sense for them to take that in Abu Dhabi in the last race of the season. So if they do decide on something like that, there's no better time than now. Red Bull, understandably, are going to be very strong across the board, the dominant car for many reasons. And then Williams, Alex Albon had a great race in Monza. That straight line speed, that top speed, proved to be the difference between him and a number of other midfield teams. Also came off the back of another strong performance in Mexico. He set a number of purple sectors at that circuit. So I do fully expect him to come through the field if he has a bad qualifying, for instance, just because of how strong that Williams is on the straight. As I pointed out, it is essentially a rectangular circuit. So most of the track is going to work in the favor of that Williams car. Something else to note, Aston Martin are obviously looking the goods after a bounce back weekend in Brazil. And Alonso, for many reasons, is on our radars. He's in one build I'm looking at the moment. On the other hand, however, a lot of us had Lewis Hamilton. I had George Russell in Brazil. Many people had triple Mercedes on their Limitless in Brazil. And I guess we were left to rue what could have been with so much expectation heading into that weekend. So I think for many people, given that Mercedes are not necessarily known to have a high top speed in comparison to their peers, what that means for them at a circuit like Las Vegas, I do worry that Lewis Hamilton and George Russell are perhaps not offering the same amount of value as some other drivers in that price bracket. The Mercedes constructor is probably a no-go for me in most situations as well. So keep an eye on practice. I know that's the most cliched response you can get from me or any of the other F1 fantasy guys out there, but it is probably going to be a very pivotal 3 practice sessions, especially because of the weather and whether or not we're able to see uninterrupted practice sessions that do allow for the teams to run effective race simulation data in the lead up to the race and in qualifying. I obviously talked about the grid penalty for Charles Leclerc. If that eventuates, he is almost certainly going to be in my team. I'll get to why that is going to be in a minute, but I just think because of the straight line speed, how fast Ferrari is going to be, even though there probably aren't going to be as many overtaking opportunities because of how narrow those straights are, and then the turns themselves are not necessarily all that wide either to facilitate overtakes. I still think the Ferrari has the ability, assuming no reliability gremlins that we come to associate them with, if they're able to, I guess, demonstrate in qualifying that the car is and has got great pace around the track, then Charles Leclerc for me, even Carlos Sainz potentially become very viable assets to own. So I just want to quickly jump into the chips. I know usually this is at the front of the video, but I wanted to put forward the reasons as to why the weather, for instance, the track characteristics, the lack of history at this circuit all lends itself to chips like autopilot and no negative. Autopilot in particular protects against the DNF risk for Max Verstappen, for instance. Most of us are almost always going to have the 2 times multiplier on Max because of the fact that he's always going to be in the mix for a podium for a win. I did put out a tweet earlier today. This is a Wednesday. I'm recording this video. That Max and Lando, and I'm probably going to jinx it, if they can go the entire... So let me start from the beginning. Neither of these 2 drivers have had a DNF this season. The last drivers to go a full season without a DNF was Carlos Sainz in 2021. And from what my research has shown, not one season has passed in F1 where more than one driver has gone without a DNF. So if Max and Lando get to the end of the season, both without DNFs throughout the season, that's going to be the first time that has happened. I think there's a very fair possibility that one or both of them could be plagued with that this weekend at Las Vegas of all circuits for the reasons I mentioned, primarily because of the fact that they just aren't going to be as comfortable with this track as many of the others on the circuit. But I think also for autopilot, let's say Max and Lando do have very good races, we become accustomed to them really driving the hell out of their cars, then I think there's going to be the possibility of Lando getting that driver of the day nomination that he has had the last few races. Throw in Max, who's always going to be scoring around 30 to 40 points if he wins on a normal race weekend. And then Charles Leclerc, if he ultimately takes that grid penalty, makes all those overtakes, those positions gained from further back in the field, what that looks like for him. And a lot of people, a lot of drivers, when they've been able to come back from 15 or 20th on the grid all the way into the top 5 of the points, even the podium, they are almost always going to come home with the driver of the day as well. So I think you throw in the fact that both Leclerc or Norris, Max could all nab driver of the day. Max and Charles Leclerc with those high speeds could be on for a fastest lap as well. I think the autopilot hedges quite nicely against a variety of different outcomes for all possible race winners or highest fantasy scorers for that weekend. As far as no negatives concerned, I guess for the reasons I mentioned previously around the track characteristics, the cold weather, the fact that in particular, there's going to be, I guess, with the cold weather, the tyres are not going to be able to warm up quite as fast. There are no high-speed corners to enable that. And you throw in the fact that the straights themselves, if we have a safety car, are not going to allow the drivers to weave and warm up the tyres quite as much or as often as perhaps they would at other circuits. So a lot of possible variables here that could certainly wreak havoc on our teams. So if you haven't already used no negative, I would absolutely use it this weekend. If you've got both autopilot and no negative, I think you realistically have to decide whether you think the delta between the winner or whether you think there's going to be more value, point scoring value in fantasy tied to the autopilot versus the no negative? Do you think it's more likely that, say, Charles Leclerc or Lando Norris is going to outscore Max Verstappen, or do you think it's more likely that one or two drivers in your team are going to end up with DNFs and as a result affect the total score of your team for that weekend? So I can't really say, because it is, as cliche as it sounds, very team dependent, but I think there's a case to be made for both of those chips this weekend. As for extra DRS, Limitless, both very powerful chips. If you haven't already used them, most of us have watching this video, I would just get rid of them straight away. Use probably either one at Abu Dhabi, just because of the fact that Max has a very good record at Abu Dhabi. So a great option for extra DRS there. Limitless, again, you're going to have 3 practice sessions at Abu Dhabi, the circuit that everyone's pretty familiar with, more so than Las Vegas. So I would save either of those two for the next race. And then wildcard final fix, very team dependent. But I think if you see a surprise in qualifying, then whip out the final fix, get it out of the way. So I'll quickly jump into how my team is looking for the Grand Prix. If you haven't checked out my team selection video, please do so. But I guess I'm boiling down to 3 different combinations. I guess the rationale, more detail around this is in my team selection video. So do check that out. It'll be at the end of the video as well if you need a quick link to that. But I think I'm still going to run Max, Lando, Red Bull, and McLaren. I've got 3 trades up my sleeve. So George Russell, because of the fact that I don't expect Mercedes to do well, is first name out of my team this weekend. I've obviously talked a lot about the strength of the Red Bull. Sergio Perez could easily come in. I think he's a very sound option. I know there's a lot of inconsistencies, that lack of reliability, and he did have another bounce back weekend most recently in Brazil. I'm just not so sure that it's enough to convince me. He will be a differential asset to own if you're in and around the top 10K or so, because a lot of engaged strategists are just not going to have that trust, that faith in Sergio Perez that he can ultimately get the job done as a fantasy asset. So this team is pretty sound in my opinion. I'm not so sure I'm that trusting of him. I've obviously talked about Charles Leclerc. I can't afford him at the moment. I'm a couple mil short, but that would obviously mean downgrading Oscar Piastri. I think I'd get Charles in if I see excellent practice times in the 3 practice sessions. B, because I'm planning on using autopilot. So I think all 3 drivers here have the chance to score very high this weekend. And C, because of the straight line speed of that Ferrari, I think they're going to be very competitive. To enable Charles, I would need to get in Alex Albon, and I've obviously talked about the strength of that Williams straight line speed. I think this is a very good build as well. Not overexposed to McLaren, to Red Bull, for instance. And I definitely think, Albon's been one of the more consistent options under, say, like 12, 13 million. I know he's had, a DNF most recently in Brazil, but that was hard to very much avoid. Up until then, it's only really been Japan. You have to go all the way back to Australia if you exclude, these 2 DNFs, but in Brazil and Japan. But, Qatar 23, United States 14, Mexico 13. All very good weekends for Alex Albon. I have a lot of confidence in him that he could do well at Las Vegas. The third build I'm looking at involves Fernando Alonso. I wouldn't say I'm 100% convinced that Aston Martin are going to do well at Las Vegas. However, I do think he is one of those options, kind of like mid-priced options, that if the Aston Martin can continue that strong form in, I guess, a car specification that looks a lot more like what we saw earlier in the season when they were doing very well, then I think he becomes a really good option to own heading into this weekend. Now, I don't mind this build necessarily. He did have, the 3rd or 4th highest fantasy score last weekend in Brazil. He could be on par for another big weekend of fantasy points. So also another option for autopilot if you have that. I have thought about potentially going no budget drivers for Las Vegas as well. Triple McLaren, Alex Albon, Alonso. Only 2 trades. I could roll the 3rd into Abu Dhabi if I needed it, but I've also got the wild card, which I probably won't end up using. But I also really like this build. AlphaTauri, if you've got Ricciardo or Sonoda, I think they're both very good options, but I do like having a non-budget driver build. It has probably a slightly higher floor because of the fact that these teams are a little bit more reliable. So I really like this build, but I guess I'm reluctant to jump in on the Aston Martin constructor or Lance Stroll, just because of the fact that Stroll, for instance, doesn't qualify that well, and I'm more convinced in Alonso in his consistency and reliability than someone like Stroll, who can be rocks and diamonds on his day. So, and Piastri as well, a much better fantasy option than Lance Stroll. So there's 3 different team builds. I go into a lot more detail on those in my team selection video, which is already up on YouTube. But I think I'm going to cut it short for there now, guys. But I'll be on Twitter in the lead up to the race, and I'm back with FanAmp for another deadline stream right before qualifying. I think we'll do it right after FP3. So lots to think about, dissect in the lead up to the race. But I appreciate you guys dropping by. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.